It's going to take a while. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of today's lectures in the Christmas series. They're really, really Christmassy themed today, as you can probably already see from the title of Ben's presentation. So just to give you a bit of a rundown, if you want to use the comments to say hello, to say where you've come from, say what time of day it is, where you are, that would be awesome. I will be hosting, but I'll be turning myself off in a moment, figuratively as well as in real life. And Ben will take the screen. Ben's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take any questions if there are any. If not, everyone can go and have a cup of festive cocoa, non-alcoholic, please. We are still on university's time. And then I will go on to the next presentation, and then we'll be left in the wilderness. But I'm sure he won't do. So I saw a version of this. Is this the talk you did a couple of weeks back, Ben?
It's fairly similar, yeah. It touches on very similar things, yeah.
Okay, well, you're in for a treat, all two of you that are watching right now. Don't worry, Ben, it will go up. Yeah. But yeah, I'd just like to just introduce Ben, who is one of the PhD cohort here, who's being supervised by Chris Headland, our head of department. There we go. We've got 7 people now. That's miles better. And he's going to be talking today about the future of virtual reality in video games. If you've got any comments or questions, you can put them in the comments and I'll be able to see them, and then I will deal with those towards the end. But he's going to talk straight through and then questions at the end. All right, then. I'm going to take myself off the chat. Take it away, Ben.
Thank you. So firstly, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has been involved with setting up these Christmas lectures. I'm always excited to talk about anything virtual reality, anything about games. I'll talk about anything, to be fair. But this topic is one of the ones that I absolutely love. Before I get into it, I just want to give you a bit of context about who I am. So as Esther said, my name is Benjamin Williams. I work here in Staffordshire University. And some of the topics I cover largely are things like virtual reality in games development, and my research interests largely come around virtual reality and procedural content generation in games. So today's talk, we're gonna look at the future of virtual reality in video games. Now, the thing about this is there's no one true answer to to what the future is going to look like. I mean, short of me having a crystal ball, I can't really tell you exactly what the future is going to look like. But we're going to go on a bit of a whistle-stop tour of virtual reality research, look at some really interesting key areas that we're looking now at, seeing these areas grow rapidly. So we're going to have a look at those and have a look around the topic and see what areas might be of interest in the future. So it will give you some idea of where we might be going in the future and some interesting things that might be coming to fruition in the next few years. So without further ado, let's get into it. So it's pretty much what I said, but in more detail, we're going to go and look at where virtual reality has come from. Right, so its roots and why virtual reality became a thing. We're going to talk about what virtual reality is and some important factors in VR's future. So things like AI, tracking, and portability. So tethered versus untethered VR. We're also going to look at the present. So what's currently happening in the VR sphere, and look slightly to the future and see what things might be just around the corner. Now, we don't know if these things are coming, if they will be part of the future, but we can certainly say that it probably will become a possibility. So one of them is this idea of having affordable peripherals like motion simulation. And that's specifically what my PhD focuses on, is on motion simulation. So we're going to have a look at that in a bit more detail. So what is virtual reality? Well, virtual reality is this far-reaching technology and well-established research domain. And what this means is that this technology, virtual reality, whether it's, headsets or you've got a cave system, usually we see headsets like this one shown here. It has far-reaching implications, right? It's not just used in games. We can use it for training purposes. We can use it for all different kinds of things. And because of that, virtual reality, it isn't a thing that's recently just popped up. It's been around in the research for years, decades, and it's a very well-established research domain. There's loads of different papers out there on how to use virtual reality to train people, to make people enjoy virtual reality better. There's a lot of different things, and it was born from this practical use. So one of the first ever papers on VR and how virtual reality became established was its use in surgery simulation. Now, surgeons, you have to go through hours and hours and hours of training just to do one small operation. And sometimes, some of these operations that they carry out might be extremely rare, right? And we need to be able to train for those. So virtual reality allows us to experience something that's simulated, right? But it's fairly close to the real thing, and allow people to train for those scenarios. And it's not just surgeons, for example. There's pilots can use virtual reality to train as well. Virtual reality has come a hell of a long way since its inception. Back in the 80s and late 70s, VR tech wasn't the best. Even the 90s, it wasn't the best, and it was very expensive. But nowadays, I mean, you can buy a Quest 2 or some other kind of headset fairly cheap nowadays. So consumers can actually buy these things. And as such, there's a hell of a lot of papers around VR, right? There's a lot of subtopics in this field. Not just games, not just, serious uses. There's a lot of different things in the literature. What virtual reality used to look like, it was this emerging technology outside of the scope of consumer products. It was this big, clunky, expensive material. Like this one here we see in this picture was a very early prototype of a VR headset made in, I think, the late 80s. And obviously, it's quite a large thing. It was one of the very first early prototypes here in the NASA Ames Research Center. A lot of the virtual reality devices back then were very large, very expensive, and inaccessible to consumers. Something like this would set you back thousands of pounds. And for that reason, research into these things was fairly limited. Not many people knew about these. And if we look at a timeline of VR tech, it kind of looks like this. So you see back in the early 30s, this guy here in the top left is Edwin Link. Edwin Link created one of the first flight simulators, called the Link Trainer. And you can actually go see the Link Trainer in some aviation museums across the UK. I went to one the other year and I saw it just randomly. I got extremely excited over this wooden flight simulator. But one of the earliest uses of VR tech was in flight simulation. They made this kind of wooden flight simulator that looked like a plane, and they put people into some kind of virtual reality to help them learn how to fly planes better. And then later on, we saw the 80s. That's where kind of digital VR became a thing. Things like headsets. This quite fetching data suit here called the VPL data suit was a feedback device in the early 80s. So a lot of these headsets were very early prototypical headsets, very heavy, didn't really run that fast, and that was because of the limitations of hardware at the time. In the 90s, we started seeing more sort of consumer level VR headsets, and obviously since the 90s up until now, we've seen a lot of advancements in VR tech. You've probably played on a Oculus Quest or something like that. They've come a hell of a long way from their birth. Nowadays, VR is established pretty much everywhere. Everyone, if you say VR, people probably know what you're talking about. VR headsets now are very popular in entertainment. So video games are a massive part of VR. They allow people to experience immersive games, and they're purchasable. Something like the Quest 2 will probably set you back, I would say, something like, off the top of my head, about £300-400. But that's purchasable. A few decades ago, these things cost upwards of £200,000. So these things are a lot more available to the average consumer. Because of that, we've seen a huge amount of research into VR tech. So some examples in the literature, here's just 4 categories, which I think are quite promising for the future. So probably one of the largest is in entertainment, and that's kind of what I'm looking at in my PhD. So we have a motion simulator. It's just there. We have this motion simulator, and I want to see how it affects the way people play games. Does it improve the game? There's a lot of different topics in this domain here, entertainment. There's a lot of different research applications and papers looking into that particular topic. There's also training, so things about like, does VR improve training in certain scenarios? So people have done papers on, for example, can you build a virtual reality simulator that helps people learn how to operate machinery and things like that. There's also immersive data viz. This is one of the most it's definitely an emerging field in VR, and we might see this come to fruition in the with this advent of metaverses and things like that. We might start seeing immersive data viz. Certainly some of the avenues of research are actually looking into this. How can we create immersive data visualizations? VR is a useful tool. Can we use it to kind of bolster our visualizations? So that's three interesting areas, and probably this is another interesting area of VR research that we might see in the future is virtual reality exposure therapy. So VRET, people who have phobias can experience them in VR and do so in a safe way, and exposing them to their fears has been shown that people can overcome their fears by using a virtual reality experience. So that's an interesting topic, and we might see that in the future as well. There's two areas of VR tech as well. So we have tethered and untethered headsets. So I was talking about this Oculus Quest. This is the one where there's no wire coming out of the back of it. That's an untethered headset. You could put on that headset and you could just walk around freely. You're not tethered to a computer. So there's the opposite of this, which is tethered headsets. So as you can see in this picture, this is a HTC Vive. And it has a wire coming out of the back of it. So that means that you're tethered to that computer. And they both serve two interesting uses. Tethered VR headsets do all the power, all the rendering, all the computation is done on a computer and sent over to the headset. So that means you can be exposed to sort of more computationally expensive VR experiences, so you can have high fidelity graphics and lots of things happening, but you're tethered in place, so you can't move very far. Untethered headsets are portable, very accessible. You could go down to the beach. I don't know why you do that, but you could go down to the beach, put on your Quest 2 onto your head, and that's fine, right? It's untethered. It's a portable device. And one of the issues of this is that you have limited computational power and limited memory. It's essentially a mobile device. So you kind of have to think, when you create a game, you have to think about whether or not you want to run it on a tethered or an untethered headset. And that's something you have to consider. To go back to that slide, actually, one thing we might see in the future regarding tethered and untethered headsets, in the last few years, we've seen massive advancements in untethered headset technology. So it was only, a few years ago, untethered headsets were very limited. We couldn't track the user's head properly. But nowadays, with things like the Quest, this is becoming a thing. So what we're probably going to see in the future are more VR headsets that are focusing on providing the best of both worlds, providing an untethered headset that allows you to run very expensive computation on there. So that's probably where the future of these headsets are going. And on that note as well, tracking is increasingly important. So we can gauge a lot of emotion from relatively simple behavior. If we track body positions, we can get an impression of people's emotion and predict their behavior. What this means is that when people, especially, now with the advent of metaverses, we're going to have these multiplayer worlds that we can interact with, and we're going to see other people, and tracking is a big part of that. You need to be able to accurately track the user's head, the user's arms, so they can have a virtual avatar in some virtual world. And this is starting to see more interest, largely because of metaverses and this boom in interest in metaverses, that we need some way of representing a virtual avatar, and tracking is a big part of that. So that's another area where we might see a lot of interest is in tracking and how to best represent virtual avatars in VR experiences. Another thing that's quite interesting about VR is this idea of multi-sensory integration. This hits quite close to home with regards to my research. My research looks at, and most of the papers I've published focus around this idea of multi-sensory integration. The thing about VR is it allows us to have these interesting sensory experiences where our body can feel one thing and our eyes can see another thing. And this leads to things like cyber sickness. So for example, if you see that you're moving through an environment, you're smoothly moving through an environment, your eyes are telling you that you're actually moving, right? But your body is saying that you're standing still. And this sensory conflict is a very interesting thing, because we don't normally see that in the real world. Normally, most of the things we do, our visual senses are perfectly correlated to our vestibular senses. In VR, there are some scenarios where that alignment isn't true. And for me, that's a really interesting area of study. What happens when we alter that congruency? Can we use things like motion simulation to shore up those differences between what you see and what you feel? And multisensory integration is all about the way we perceive the world. We build a perception of the world from all the senses we use, all our senses. So if we see a tree and we feel the wind blowing against our skin and we can hear the tree rustling, then we can build a pretty accurate picture that we're outside and we're in a forest looking at a tree on a windy day. You can take all those different sensory inputs and build a picture of the world. And this is why VR, it's so interesting. You see these peripheral devices that people use. A motion simulator is a good example of one, where people nowadays have these things in their houses, and they're playing racing games and using these motion simulators to provide a more realistic experience. They want this fully immersive experience. And it's not just motion simulators, it's things like they have these haptic gloves, they have all different kinds of peripherals. And that's one area where we see a fair amount of research in, is building these peripherals, right? Making them work and provide more immersive experiences. It's very closely related to this idea of presence in VR. So this idea of presence is how immersed you are in the environment. If you are in a virtual reality experience and you feel like you're there, your presence is extremely high. You feel like you are present in that virtual world, and that's why it's called presence. If you feel like you're present in that virtual world, you can see the virtual objects in the world. You can see this giant virtual mountain, right? You can feel the air against your skin. You can hear things that you can hear the birds tweeting. All of these sensory inputs build a picture of you being in that virtual world. And that's why it's so important, right? In VR, sensory information is critical to the way we experience virtual reality. And as a result, there's a lot of research into this area as well. And I'm one of those people looking at this. I'm specifically looking at motion simulation. But in a nutshell, this is what multisensory integration is. If this is the exact example that I used earlier, if we have three sensory modalities, that's just a fancy word for three different senses. If we feel the air against our skin and we feel that change in temperature, if we hear the sound of leaves whooshing, right? That's the technical term. Rustling, I suppose, is a better word. But if we hear those leaves rustling and we see these trees swaying quite fast in the breeze, we can take all of that information and build quite an accurate picture that we're probably standing outside on a windy day. And that's the point, is if you took out one of these senses, say if you got rid of this, you weren't hearing this rustling of leaves, you weren't seeing the sight of the tree swaying. All the information you've got to go on is the air against your skin. Well, that would mean that it could be anything. It doesn't have to be a windy day. You could be falling from a plane, the more sensory inputs you have, the more senses that are used in that integration process, the clearer the picture of the world becomes. And this is one of the reasons why people who are obsessed with enjoying immersive VR experiences have all these different peripherals. I'm one of these people. I love VR stuff. So I'll have a motion simulator, I'll have a headset on with audio giving me feedback, even somatic, airflow feedback. That's 3 or 4 different senses. It gives you a very clear picture of the world, of what's actually happening in that virtual world. So the more sensory inputs you have in that integration process, the more immersed you are in that experience, the more you feel present in that virtual environment. So that's all multisensory integration is, and it's a very interesting topic of research. There are different types of feedback that are being experimented with in VR. So we've got things like haptics. So people have built these haptic devices where we have these gloves you can slip on, and it makes you feel like you're touching things in VR, right? So you might see, say for example, you're in a virtual world and you pick up a baseball, let's say. You pick up that baseball. If you don't have a haptic glove, you have no sensation of that baseball's weight. And what these haptic gloves do is they provide resistance. So if you're wearing one of these gloves, if you pick up an object in the virtual world, it will feel like you're holding that object. And I've got to say, it's quite an unusual experience when you're in VR and you forget that you're wearing these gloves. Just that one notion of feeling the weight of something, it adds so much to the experience. So this is actually one of the things we're probably going to see in the future. And to be fair, there's companies coming sort of left, right, and center building these different haptic gloves. So a good one is Hapdex. So Hapdex is a company that is at the frontier of building these haptic devices, and they're looking at creating these devices and having them work with popular VR headsets. So you could go out, buy some of these gloves, and use them when you're playing a a virtual reality game. So there's a lot of, in the future, we're probably going to see a big shift in actually using these, I'm kind of going off my words here, but these consumers. You'll probably see these devices being pushed more towards consumers, and they'll probably reduce in price, and you'll be able to use them. Another area is somatic, so somatosensory feedback. So things like airflow. It's one of the cheapest VR peripherals you can actually use. So this will give you airflow feedback. If you're speeding through the world, it will blow air in your face quite fast. And there's a hell of a lot of products out there on the market that'll do this for you. Of course, there's motion simulation, which is my wheelhouse, I suppose, and there's olfactory as well. So this is a very interesting avenue of kind of people building these VR peripherals. Is that we've got things like scent masks. So people are looking into how to build olfactory feedback in VR as well. My area of research, of course, concerns motion simulation. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So motion simulation, here we've got the Atomic A3 motion simulator. As I showed before, it's right here in one of our VR labs here in Staff's uni. But what is motion simulation? So motion simulators are devices that create the feeling of movement in a real world, in a real motion environment. So the idea is you'd sit on one of these chairs, and the chair would tilt as you move through the virtual world, and it would make you feel like you're actually moving. Oftentimes, we just tilt the chair But there are other devices which actually physically move you up and down. And we synchronize this usually with the rest of the things going on in VR. So if you look like you're going quite fast in a racing game, we'll move the chair back to give this sense of acceleration. So we often synchronize it with the headset. So that's what motion simulation is. Motion simulators are just devices that recreate the feeling of motion, and that's it really. There are two fields. So there's motion simulations in robotics, and there's motion simulation in terms of VR. So it can get confusing when you search this, but we're looking at this one here, where in virtual reality. And motion simulation, again, has come quite a long way. The Link trainer that I discussed earlier is an example of a motion simulator. They used these bellows, like bellows that you use to stoke a fire. They used this type of system to move the Link trainer around. Very interesting. Nowadays, we've got these multi-million-pound simulators, which I'm quite jealous of. I'd love to have a go on one of these, which is basically just a giant robot arm with a seat on the end. It's called the MPI Cybermotion Simulator, and it's very, very cool. Have a look at it. Have a look at some videos of it. It's very cool. Motion simulation today, it's still fairly expensive, but it is gradually reducing in price. It's now cheaper and accessible than ever before to buy one of these things, right? And that's not the case. So like if you look a decade back, these things cost upwards of £100,000. Whereas nowadays you can get a motion simulator for probably about £1,000 to £2,000. So they're slowly getting towards the level of price where people can actually buy these and put them in their home. One thing about motion simulation is as it's becoming more and more popular, we are coming more and more close to standardization. So you should be able to just plug one of these things in and it just, boom, it works with your game. At the moment, that's not necessarily the case. You have to do some weird, funky things to get it working. And that's actually one of the areas of research we're looking at right now in Staffordshire University, is building standardization for these motion simulators. The middleware supports a lot of VR simulation games, so things like Project Cars 2, X-Plane, these different flight simulators. And motion simulation is now used quite a lot in hobbyist simulation communities. So people have these DIY flight simulators and racing simulators. Maybe they dedicate a room in their house to one of these sim pits. So it's quite an interesting thing. But yeah, a good example of this is the YourVR. YourVR simulator is one of the cheapest motion simulators you can buy. And as you can see, it's still quite expensive, but it's in the realms of possibility. You could buy one of these things and put it in your office or something. They built this motion simulator with that in mind. It folds up and you can just store it under the desk. So we're starting to see that shift from motion simulators being these massive multi-million-pound things that people like Boeing and BAE Systems can buy, now towards these cheaper, smaller devices that people can put in their homes. Where we're seeing the future of motion simulation, kind of where it's going, like I said, simulators are moving more now towards home usage. We're slowly becoming more and more close to standardization, and simulators are now cheaper than ever due to the VR boom and cheaper hardware. So very interesting. So to cap this talk off with the title that we talk about, what will the future be? Well, we can't say for certain, but we've gone through some really interesting areas. Probably here are 5 things that I think will be in the future of VR, what we're going to look at. Environmental awareness and tracking. So tracking is a huge part of VR. We're probably going to see a lot of interest in building those tracking algorithms and creating a way of, representing people virtually in a virtual world for metaverses, right? We're probably going to see multiplayer VR and metaverses. We're already seeing this massive boom in metaverse technology, and we're probably going to look at more into untethered headsets, so making these much more powerful and being able to build to experience much more high fidelity simulations. Complex characters and animation. and also affordable peripherals. So on that note, I'll say thanks for listening, and if anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Cheers.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben. I need to like an applause emote from Zoom. Cool. Okay. So thanks to everybody who tuned in and out. It was kind of interesting watching where everyone was coming in from. So I've got a couple of questions, but we've already had one from Lavender May here, who asks, oh, look, there's more coming in. Is there a goal with sensory integration developments, or is it to only emulate real life? That's really interesting because it was sort of the question I was going to ask. So yay.
So it's a good question. In terms of sensory integration research, we're looking at in the research what it actually means to the experience itself. So, for example, we're trying to see if we can use congruency to make people better experience games. So, for example, a motion simulator is a perfect example here. We don't actually know, and this is something I wasn't really going to talk about here because I could go on for ages about it. We don't really know the effects of sensory integration with regards to motion simulation and how it affects people in VR, right? In people in games. So we're trying to ask the questions of, does that actually help people play the game better? Do they enjoy it more? Normally in VR, we try to if we have multiple peripherals and different sensory modalities that are being used in VR, it is to emulate real life. It is to kind of embody more immerse you in that virtual environment. But we are looking at like what that sensory integration process looks like in VR and how altering some of the relationships between cross-modal feedback actually affects the way people play games, people experience games, and if they enjoy them. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an answer.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well, isn't it? It's that kind of, we know that we can do it, but should we kind of thing. And that's always very interesting to sort of consider, because sure, we see that in all the movies. It's like, they dug too deep. But, as you sort of mentioned, motion sickness and other sicknesses are kind of an issue. And I think when you were sort of talking about exposure therapy as well, it's like, how much is too much? There's some really interesting implications. And I know that you've gone into them elsewhere in your research as well. So everybody do go away and look at the papers that Ben's written, because they're really interesting. And as you can tell from his talk, he's a really readable writer as well. So yeah. Okay, right. Let's go on to the next question. And Lavender says, thank you very much. Oh, that's a funny thing. I'm going to pass this one a little bit. So without the aid of external hardware, what do you think that will be the elements in enhancing player immersion in VR? So yeah, if we don't have all those things, so that VR machine that you showed, which again you showed in the previous one, it reminds me of a little bath. It's like sitting in a little bath and having a VR headset on. But because it also made me think, there are other ways that we simulate things that aren't necessarily, I can get in a bath and think, oh, I'm in the sea. Not very realistic sea, but it's still there. So what do you think that the elements in enhancing player immersions in VR will be without external hardware?
So this is actually, again, another avenue of research that people are looking at, and it's a very good point, because sometimes people don't have access to these things or peripherals. How can you, without all that technology, improve presence in VR? There's actually a lot of factors in what makes people present in a virtual world. One of them, for example, what we found, it's quite an interesting one actually. The more realistic graphics we have in VR, the less immersed players become, which is quite strange, because you'd think that the more kind of realistic the stuff is in VR and the more it looks like real life, the more immersed they might get in that. But what we see is this relationship between kind of cartoony, stylized content actually immersing people quite a lot in VR. And I think it's partly down to the uncanny valley, I suppose. And another thing as well that's is certainly something you have to consider with immersion is cyber sickness, right? And tracking issues. So we need some of the things that can influence presence a lot are things like errors, tracking errors. you can be in the best game in the world, you can have totally immersed experience, but if you lose tracking for a second, you're taken out of that experience completely. And that's something that is, again, a very interesting thing that we have to look into. So there's a lot of different factors out there, even human factors. We've found that people who are between the ages of 18 and I think it's about 39 to 41 experience VR a lot more. They get much more immersed in an environment than people outside of those ranges. There's a lot of factors that go into immersion, and there's so much we can do with it for sure.
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting, isn't it? That the more that we immerse ourselves, the more our brains decide they want to tell us that we're not really immersed. And I've certainly sort of noticed this with other things as well, that, as you say, the kind of we put more into stylized representation, so cartoons and almost artistic presentation, than we do kind of real things. And again, we have now all been marked unsafe from the last mention of the Uncanny Valley. It's been only a minute since the last mention of the Uncanny Valley. You must get that a lot. Okay, let's go on to our last question before we say thank you very much. And thank you, Isaac Y for that one. Okay, so the last one is, with regards to motion simulation, do you think we can reach a point where people could emulate an experience such as learning to drive a car?
So I think this is a really interesting question as well. Is the reason it's interesting is because we see this in flight simulation. Pilots nowadays do a large majority of their training in things like flight simulators. It's an interesting question. I'm not too sure of the answer, to be honest, but I can certainly say motion simulators, along with most other devices that we use in VR, have come a hell of a long way. In the last few years, we've seen these motion cueing algorithms becoming more and more accurate and much more responsive. Old motion simulators are terrible because they don't really feel like they're actually moving you. They're very slow. They're very wishy-washy. Nowadays, it's quite quick, I suppose, and they jerk you around. It's an interesting question. I think eventually it might become a possibility, but I can't say for sure. It's definitely an interesting question.
It's levels as well, isn't it? Because obviously simulation has been used to teach, again, flight. A lot of pilots during COVID kept their hours in by doing virtual simulations because they couldn't get charter on the flights. And because you have to have a certain amount of hours every year to retain your pilot's license, people were actually using virtual simulators in order to do it. And, obviously we've been training people to go into space on simulators for years and years, but were they like the Link machine? Were they people just wafting air at people? So, was that one at Duxford, by the way? Was it Duxford that you saw the Link? I was just where can people go to see it? Said the ex-military researcher.
I'm not too sure. I think it was. I think it might have been the Lincolnshire Aviation Museum, maybe.
Awesome. Cool.
I went there and I thought, oh, that's quite cool, and then I saw it in the corner and I immediately just oh my god.
I love the idea of people literally standing there with big boards. So what an amazing progression as well, right from there to sort of where we are now. That's just so interesting. Okay, so we've run out of time, and I need to go on to the next talk, which will start in about 5 minutes. I'll need to make sure I've orientated the next speaker, but I will be back in a moment. I think there's 2 of them actually. So if we could just say thank you very much to Ben. That would be amazing. Thank you so much, Ben. That was absolutely fascinating. It's really interesting to hear you speak. I love listening to people speak more than once because they always say different things. It's just like you just get these kind of extra stuff. But if you're staying on, then I will see you in just about 5 minutes. But so thank you very much. All right.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.